Good morning. I'd like to thank Kevin for asking me to be part of the Ag Week breakfast this year. We received the Renew Rural Iowa Award a few years ago, and we appreciate being recognized by the Iowa Farm Bureau with this award. As Kevin mentioned, it took a while to get me to agree to come up today, so he caught me at a weak moment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Wold Wheels this morning, and also a little bit about the Mitchell County EDC. I think it ties in well with the Renew Rural Iowa, as well as maintaining a healthy economy in Mitchell County. As Darla mentioned, Wold Wheel was founded by my parents, Ari and Janet. My dad came back from the service after serving in the Korean conflict and worked with my grandfather in a gas station. My dad commented that it would be difficult to raise a family or support a family with the income from the gas station, so he got into the farm tire business. In the early 60s, the largest farm tire being produced, through my understanding, is a 15.538. The tire manufacturers came out with 18.4s and 20.8 widths. And of course, the farmers wanting bigger, better. There was the need to widen the rims to accommodate the larger tire sizes on their tractors. So my dad went to Jerry Doler, a local blacksmith, and tried to convince him to start widening some rims for him. Jerry wanted no part of it, but was willing to work with my dad to build a roller so that my dad could do it himself. So together they built a roller to roll the widening band that was needed to widen the rim. The same thing happened with the combine size tires. 18.426 was the largest size. They came out with 23.1s, 28Ls, 24.5s, 30.5, so the same thing, or the same need was to widen those rims. Other tire dealers learned about my dad widening the rims, and they started bringing him rims to widen for their customers. This started our dealer network, and many of those dealerships continue to be our dealers today. In the 70s, we ventured into the Terra tire business. The fertilizer industry started having the need for floater trucks, and there was a huge need for rims to supply all the new floater trucks that were being sold. In the 80s, we developed a straddle dual system for combines with Paul Kirchner. Ridge-till farming was popular, and there was the need to get the tires centered in between the row and get the tires off the row. The combines performed better with duals and singles, so many of the non-ridge-till farmers saw the advantages of the duals. The 90s brought narrow row farming with more options with narrow, taller tires, and the sugar beet country started going to 22-inch rows and utilizing the narrow tires. So we sold many wheels up in the Red River Valley to support the 22-inch row conversions. As Darla said, we've continued to develop and offer solutions for new tire sizes, bigger equipment, and changes in farm practices. Today we have over 40 employees, and we actually are taking applications to add a few more employees to our production team. So if you know of anyone interested, please send them to our website and fill out an application. We process over 1,700,000 pounds of steel annually. We utilize 35,000 pounds of welding wire and 20,000 pounds of powder for our powder coat paint system. We have 124,000 square foot under roof and have sold our wheels in all 50 states and Canada. This past year, we worked on a project with Titan Tire to build wheels that were shipped to France that were used on a special sprayer application there. We also worked with Firestone Tire and supplied them with wheels for some prototype test tires that ended up on a combine or a couple combines in China to help with some wet harvest conditions over there. Today our focus is on growing our dealer base through geographic growth. So enough about us. I'd like to segue a little bit into the Mitchell County Economic Development growth. In the letter that I think Beth sent out, I noticed their focus this year was highlighting maintaining vital communities in our county. I am a board member on the Mitchell County EDC. I'm going to share my personal perspectives and thoughts about my role on that board. Not the official spokesman for the group, so I just want to share my thoughts. And I've always thought that for the Mitchell County EDC to be successful, we need a strong ag economy, we need a strong manufacturing base, and we need healthy main streets. The Mitchell County EDC was founded in 2001 And over the years, we've assisted many local business with expansions and welcomed several new industries to Mitchell County. I see the value in providing employment opportunities with direct off-farm income for our farmers, off-farm income for the spouses or children of the farm families, and I also see many of our employees helping out farmers in the spring and fall in the seasonal role that you guys need to support your farming operations. The challenges I see today from our industry perspective is the many job openings that remain unfilled in our county. We currently have 90 job openings in Mitchell County, and some of the sponsors' tables here are in the same boat as we are. Available workforce is a very big problem, and it restricts our industry's ability to grow. Housing also presents a challenge with the workforce recruitment, and we as an EDC are looking at a program to help assist with that challenge. Our Economic Development Board is made up of 2 representatives from 4 communities in Mitchell County, 1 rep from the Board of Supervisors, and each community appoints a rep from their city council and from their EDC group. The communities are Stacyville, Amanda Adams and Harley Bisbee are the reps on our board, Riceville with Terry Burns and Steve Eastman, Osage with Rick Bodensteiner and Calvin Paulsick, St. Ansgar with Paul Groth and myself, and the Board of Supervisors has appointed Bart Francis. Our Executive Director is Tony Stonecipher, and Administrative Assistant is Jessica Marson. And I'm confident to say that this board is looking for the best interest of Mitchell County. In closing, I'd like to share a comment that someone made at a regional meeting a few years ago that I attended. There were reps from Nyakog, or roughly 10 North Iowa counties. We broke out into small groups for discussion. When I mentioned that I was from Mitchell County, an individual asked me, "How do you guys get so much done up there?" And at the time, it seemed like we were in the news often with a lot of positive projects happening. And he commented that they could not get anything done in their county. He said the powers to be were against everything. They would not spend money and basically did nothing. He felt they were dead in the water. And I don't know that I had any profound advice to offer him, but I think I said, we find a way to work together and get things done. And so I think we should be proud of what we've accomplished in Mitchell County from the economic development side, whether it's in the agriculture, whether it's in the industrial, or whether it's in our main streets. And I think we should continue to find a way to work together and get things done to improve Mitchell County and North Iowa. Thank you.
Kansas town of Sabetha. He received degrees in agricultural economics at Kansas State and Purdue. He has been at Iowa State since 1986. Edelman is the director of the ISU Community Vitality Center, the CVC, since 2002. CVC does research to support entrepreneurship, philanthropy, rural demonstration projects. Edelman has also provided technical assistance and advised several rural business ventures involving rural housing, biofuels, and angel investor networks. He served on the board for Land O'Lakes and Amazing Energy Ethanol Board. He is a past chair of the Iowa Rural Development Council and is a former Boone City Council member. He currently serves on the Ag Ventures Alliance Board and Iowa Small Business Development Statewide Advisory Committee. Since the 1980s, Edelman has co-authored columns periodically for Farm Journal, Successful Farming, and AgriPulse Communications. Please welcome Dr. Edelman. His remarks are titled, Strategies for Entrepreneurial Rural Communities.
Can you hear me? Is it on?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, it's great to be back in Osage and Mitchell County, and I thank Darla and also Ivan, great speech, because oftentimes what you learn about how well you're doing it here in Mitchell County is to visit other counties in the state and find out that things aren't quite going quite so well. but it's my privilege to be here. I enjoyed the drive up yesterday on the first day of partial day of spring. Today is the first full day of spring, and the weather's turning, hopefully, to where things will start to happen and green up for us. Put everybody in a much better mood than all the snow that we've had to contend with this winter. It's also great to be a cyclone this week. I have to mention that. And looking forward to and also to share some of my observations. I'm kind of entering the close to retirement phase of my professional career, and so I'm happy to share some of the observations and studies that we've worked on regarding rural development over the last several years. And as Darla mentioned, I'm from a town of about 2,500 people in northeast Kansas. I grew up on a farm, but it was a town that was also similar to Mitchell County in some respects, because it was like any other agricultural town based economy until the Great Depression came along. And in this one, of course, you used to have much larger farm families back in those days in the Depression era, and one family with 13 kids told the last two during about 1935 that we don't have enough wherewithal to get you into farming, so you better figure out something else to do. And it sounds like that was about the time that diversification happened to the Wold business as well, looking at other kinds of things. And so they went out to the shop and started working with front-end loaders, came out with one of the first patents for old Farmall H's and M's for manure loaders with the boom, and then that turned into livestock pelleting mill a couple of decades, well, actually 1 decade later. And by the late 40s, they were producing some of the first extruders. About the time the baby boom generation came along and snack foods came along and breakfast food came along with a mega trend that really turned their local business into an international business. And so it's important to observe some of these mega trends that are occurring. And that's not the end of the story, but today that business is the largest employer in my hometown. And it's still producing extruders for the human food. So they went from basically manure scooping to livestock feed to human food over the last 85 years. And so it's important to always keep your eyes on what can add value to your business and in the process and in the entrepreneurial vein. The important thing too is that there are businesses that get a good start during downtimes in the economy. Why is that? Because sometimes we don't like to talk about business failure, but that often creates the grist for starting new businesses that take off, and we'll talk more about that. But let me start with the general economy, because that's always a good place to start when you think about where we're at today. And as we look at the general economy, I have 3 pluses. One for GDP growth is fairly strong at about 3%. So the general economy is fairly strong. Unemployment's low, and interest rates are relatively low. Those are 3 big pluses, and so most of the prognosticators expect the general economy to hum along at least for the rest of the year. Now, on the negative side, of course, we know we have over $1 trillion budget deficit that's built into our federal budgets, and we have our trade policy and deficits to contend with, and that's certainly affecting the agriculture. One of the things that's important to recognize about our general economy, though, is as we look at the national income accounts, 70% is consumer driven. 70% of our economy is consumer driven. 10% is business investment, and then 20% is essentially government. And so it's important to recognize that we're trying to, in some respects, with fiscal policy and monetary policy, trying to manage the overall economy with the government sector only being about 20% of the total, and that's federal, state, and local combined. So in many respects, government is sort of the tail wagging the dog, because whatever consumers believe in their tastes and preferences really drive what's going on in the economy, and why expectations of consumers and business are important to the process. Exports and imports, about 15% of the economy. Now let me, so we've got a really strong general economy going on, and that's a good thing. That provides some shock absorber for the ag economy, because the ag economy has seen nationally 1/2 of the net farm income this past year than what we saw 5 years ago. And that's significant. We've got exports. We've depended in agriculture and building up since the end of World War II our trade by reducing trade barriers. But this last year we see what we built up and invested in terms of infrastructure to accommodate exports and imports. The 25% to 40% of our ag sector really depends on what goes on in international trade. In biofuels, we've seen, which has been a big shock absorber and probably the most significant rural development occurrence since during my professional career, is the advent of biofuels. It's been hijacked in the ethanol industry somewhat by the refinery waivers, and we'll see what happens if we get year-round E15 by this summer or not. The only strong part, and it's a slow growth thing, is domestic food and uses of the ag sector, and that generally depends on population growth, which is, we know in our well-developed economy is about 1% a year. So there's a lot of uncertainty in 2 out of the 3 legs that underpin the agriculture sector. And so it's never been a time that's been more important to think about strategies and tools for being a shock absorber and looking at entrepreneurship and innovation in ways that can help provide that shock absorption for the economy. Now, I talked a little bit about my hometown and how it compares a little bit to Mitchell County. But I also wanted to bring in a little bit more of another story related to consumer policy and mega trend opportunities, and why it's important to pay attention to what goes on, what consumers are thinking about. And it reminds me of the story of one of my old professors talked about in back when I was in college several years ago. One year he was on a panel with Oklahoma League of Women Voters, and the topic was the quality of beef that was provided in the food industry. And there was a representative of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association that was on the panel, and it was a panel of consumers, and this one cowboy and his college professor, and they asked the cattleman some tough questions. He got flustered, and he basically ended up saying something to the effect that, "Damn it, beef is good for you, now buy it and shut up." And my professor was kind of taken back and said, asked him, well, Jim, how many pounds of beef do you think you sold with that statement? And that highlights some of the frustration that we see with the issue of climate change and the trends in foods that we see today that are really consumer driven. And we have to recognize that our consumers nationally, we have 2/3 to 3/4 of our population that lives on the coast. And that in many respects is where much of the consumer tastes and preferences are generated that drive our ag economy. So it's always important to remember that they are our customers and to treat accordingly. Now recently I attended the Land O'Lakes annual meeting up in the Twin Cities, and they had a consumer panel of about 6 people. I don't think anybody was my age. They were all younger, and I'm close to 65, so that tells you the age. Millennials, some were basically interested in providing nutritious, healthy, natural foods for their families and their kids. Many of them had kids. And so we talked about how they made their food choices, which was sort of interesting, and where they get their information. Of course, I asked the same question to my college class. I teach a course in economic development at Iowa State. And it's always interesting. Every year I ask the classes, where do you get your news? Do you read the newspaper? No hands go up. I said, well, where do you get your news? It's all on social media. It's all off the internet. And so that's as you would expect, that's where many of these consumers that were on this Land O'Lakes panel, that's where they were getting their news, was off of social media sources. Which is important because it's self-selection in many respects. There's a distrust of large corporations. They're open to connecting with family farmers, which is interesting. They're concerned about the environment. They don't want to see. They're concerned about climate change. They're concerned, some concerned about GMOs, but not so much. Sort of dual opinions on that particular issue. And so it's important. Now, it's sort of interesting. I heard on the news yesterday that 4 large multinational corporations like Mars, Nestle, Unilever, and Danone have announced that they're going to weigh in on the dietary requirements and also on climate change during, and they formed a coalition to help drive some of the discussion on diets and climate change. Now, climate change, as you think about, I'm not an advocate for or against, but just as you read the politics, it's a concern of a large number of people. And our government is run by those who show up. So regardless of whether you agree with it or not, as an entrepreneur, I would be thinking about, well, how can I make money out of this? If there are going to be changes, how can the economy begin to deal with and perhaps entrepreneurially forge that into something that can create value? And we're seeing that with many sectors and with the policies that California and the West Coast states are adopting in that regard. So many of those changes are going to be driven. For example, okay, the Omega chicken that's now produced air-cooled Simply Essentials in Charles City is an example. In the western part of the state is Lincoln Premium Poultry, where Costco is building, one of the counties, Harrison County, is building 60 chicken barns at $2 million each that are being financed individually by farmers to feed into their processing network in Fremont that is surrounded by floodwaters currently, but they built it on a 500-year floodplain, so it's out of the water, but they've had difficulty getting things to and from it. But the point is that last year California passed a resolution, as they often do, for cage-free poultry production. And so this whole system of a couple of hundred poultry barns, each with 40,000 chickens, are built to those standards. Now, why are these barns going up so quick? Because they're offering 15-year contracts with a labor package of about $120,000 each. And farmers are, of course, using their assets in collaboration with folks like the co-bank and the banks, the private banks, to finance the farms. So that's a different style of entrepreneurship. That's large-scale national entrepreneurship that's occurring in the process. But it will produce, ethically produced chickens. Some of the research that's done, I thought the interesting statement was, well, the research does show that the chickens are happier. How do you know the chickens are happier in that kind of environment? Well, they sing more. Have you ever heard chickens sing? I used to collect the eggs of chickens at home. We only had about a flock of 30, the way that they always used to work. But you could tell when the chickens were happy because they would walk around and just sing. You know, I won't go any further on that. So what do entrepreneurial communities do? You know what they do, but sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you don't really recognize it until you go see what others are doing. You identify the trends, the top problems to solve. You assemble talented people and resources who work together to create the problem and problem-solving capacity. You examine the innovations and problem-solving alternatives and consequences and make a decision. And then community leaders, I leave my hand back there.
Okay.
Then community leaders and entrepreneurs, sometimes they have to pivot, adapt, and don't take no for an answer to get the job done. That's what entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial communities do. We did a study in 2004 of 8 paired communities. Now, most real economists would say that you need more observations than 8, but I'm sort of a practical person from the rural, and let's see what we can figure out with 8 communities and learn from that. We interviewed 75 people in the process across these paired communities. 4 of these communities were all rural. These are all 8 rural communities, non-metro communities. 4 of them were fast-growing during the previous decade, and 4 of them had lost population. So we wanted to figure out what Group A was doing differently from Group B. And after we got through interviewing the 75 leaders from economic development, local government, education, and healthcare, our basic findings were that those that had 2 of the 4 that had lost population had lost a major employer and had not recovered enough by the end of the decade to make up the difference. Then we went to the group that had rapid population growth, and we found basically that as we went across these 4 groups of leaders, all members of all 4 groups were singing from the same song sheet. Thank you. What do I mean by that, singing from the same song sheet? They could all articulate what the plans and goals of the county were, or the community was, and what their tools were that they were using to accomplish those goals. They went the extra mile to make things work in using the tools for both the business involved as well as the community. And in all 4 cases of those fast-growing communities, there was at least 1 or more of the top 5 employers in that community that was a homegrown business that was started a few decades before. Why is that important? Well, locally owned businesses add another multiplier to the local economy in terms of an economic multiplier, in terms of how the dollars turn over in the community. So that's why local ownership is important. That's why I was really impressed with the biofuels industry, because it's mostly locally owned across the state. The other study that we did that's kind of interest was in a few years later, where we surveyed movers into and out of non-metro counties in Iowa. We took 20 counties and we purchased a database to identify those who had moved into and out of those non-metro counties to ascertain the major reasons and major factors in why they moved. And of course, as you might expect, the number one top priority influencing where and why people moved had to do with job opportunities, and that was particularly important for young people thinking about families. The under 30 crowd, the under 35 crowd. Job opportunity was most important. Other reasons close to family, community factors, and housing was important, particularly for local movers and as well as attracting new workers to the community. So as I think about my role on the Iowa Rural Development Council, their top priorities as they have worked with the governor this past year in empowering rural Iowa, their two top priorities that they've identified were broadband, I have to tie my hand behind that, broadband and housing. And those are top priorities, seems to be with many of the rural communities across the state. So it's important to recognize that, as was pointed out, what are the top priorities and challenges facing the rural communities, basic industries. It's important to stay in tune with what's going on to understand the opportunities in agriculture and manufacturing, biochemicals and Main Street, as was discussed. You have to be proactive, particularly if there's a loss of a major employer. But it's my understanding, and as I drove up here yesterday, I see these nice wind turbines that are generating property tax dollars and economic activity in your county, as they are in many counties across the state. Housing is something that I know has been a priority for your county. And so as you think about broadband and precision agriculture and the needs of millennials, that's an important factor to think about as we move into the future. I did want to point out that I've been involved in some housing projects in rural communities the last, since 1996. And learned a few things along the way. One of the things, the reason I got into it was because we had plenty of builders in the community that I was in when we started, but nobody was willing to work on developments. And so there was a need, and we filled that gap. My wife had some prior experience in real estate, and in the process, we learned the developments used tax increment financing. It simply made sense from a taxpayer perspective, if you're building houses worth $200,000 or $150,000 to $200,000 and replacing pre-World War II housing stock that on average has a market value of less than 50, then you're getting 4 times as much property taxes from the new houses as you are the average one that's being replaced. And so there is some room for some incentives to work on this housing stock issue that faces many rural communities across the state. Two areas that I wanted to talk about before I close really has to do with innovation ecosystem support. There's been a lot of changes in Iowa's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Our current president at Iowa State is very supportive of developing a statewide entrepreneurial ecosystem. You have a lot of entrepreneurial activities and education programs and networks that are supportive of development of entrepreneurial spirit here in Mitchell County, and we'd like to see that spread across the state. We did a survey in the Community Vitality Center in which only about 11% of our adult population is predisposed towards entrepreneurial activity. But they come in all income levels. They come in all industries, and so entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial activity can be created basically in businesses, at home, in government, to find better ways of doing things. do entrepreneurial communities do? They have a point of contact for entrepreneurial activity, for building networks, for helping those who are just have decided that they want to do something entrepreneurial to connect with the existing networks. 4-H and FFA and young professionals are a starting point for younger generations, but also executive networks, peer group mentoring networks, business plan competitions and innovation awards, access to the pipeline of innovators and talent. I know you have strong relationships with NIAC, and they're a fairly entrepreneurial community college with the Papa John Center. They are probably one of the top 2 or 3 community colleges in entrepreneurship in the state. Iowa State has an ag startup engine and has entrepreneurial development programs in all of its colleges, in addition to the tech transfer research that's being done in a lot of the engineering areas at the University and Research Park. One of the things that you have to think about is what are the incentives that are needed to attract those young people back to the community. In some cases, you don't want to just keep them here for their whole life. You want them to get out and experience innovation in many industries and then bring that innovation experience back to their home community. And so one of the reasons I'm not in my hometown is because the opportunity wasn't open there for me at the particular time that I was graduating from college. So I went on and liked what one of my professors was doing and emulated and followed his path. So the point is, it's important for communities to think about how do we incentivize and attract and create the kinds of internships that might bring those students back to the community and attract others from other places who may not have ever lived in a small community. That's important as well. Capital networks are important, and I've spent the last 5 years working on discussions and holding forums with rural entrepreneurs searching for equity capital, as well as venture capitalists and angel networks that are interested in rural deals, talking about their criteria. And they seem to be talking past each other in many respects. So as a result of that effort, we identified some gaps for Iowa and created a project and received a couple of grants to try to help to address those needs. And so if you're interested in equity capital, there's a flyer. We have, I've conducted a dozen different interviews with venture capital and angel investor networks across Iowa that are interested in doing rural deals. Each video is 7 minutes long, so it's something that you can do on your own time and at your own speed, but it's important to understand what's out there and what the opportunities are in terms of rural investment. My home community, part of the reason it was successful was that about every decade there was someone in this company that was the entrepreneurial company that started the ball rolling that basically concluded, well, I can do things better than this company, or they had an innovative idea that fit with the megatrends that was happening in the economy, and they went out and started their own firm. And as they looked for capital in the community, there was well-known informal investor network that had the reputation of backing new businesses, where the business plan made sense. So every decade there was a new manufacturing business that was created because that first manufacturing business attracted the right workforce of engineers and sales people who had the talent that could serve multiple businesses in the community. Today there's probably about 8 to 10 manufacturing companies just located in this small community of about 2,600. They're the only community in the state that has more jobs in the community than has population, because they attract people in from surrounding communities. So cultivating and thinking about your workforce and where your talent comes from for sustaining your workforce is very important, as well as making sure that the capital is available for the right opportunities as they occur. So let me bring this to a close by saying that some opportunities may only come along once, and so the question is if not now, when? And if not you, who? Spark plugs start and keep things running. Homework makes it work. Networks and teamwork get the job done. Success is a lot of little things done right. Successful rural leaders don't take no for an answer. They learn to pivot, become innovative, and figure out how to get things done. The biggest thing they have to contend with is folks who say, we've never done it that way before. We've tried that before and it didn't work. Well, just because you tried it 30 years ago doesn't mean that it might not work today under different circumstances. Our community is not ready for that. It often takes a decade for a startup to start up, and that's important too, particularly that's one of the things I've learned with some of the commercialization of technologies at Iowa State. You're really talking about a decade-long process, that it's not just let's start this year and everything's up and running next year. It's a process that takes oftentimes a decade to become commercial from pilot stage. So when's a good time to start? Anytime that there's a business plan that makes sense and can work. The farm co-ops doubled in terms of numbers during the latter part of the Great Depression. Business failures create cheap inputs for the next ventures. Many farmers who were successful in the 60s and 70s were those who bought land right at the end of the Great Depression. So what will the story be for Mitchell County told in 40 years? Will it be the one where population continued to grow because of the entrepreneurial opportunities and the workforce that was created, with innovations that bloomed and prospered because everyone sang from the same song sheet? Or will it be a story where the population economy peaked and reversed? The answer rests in your hands. But with the kinds of activities that you've been working on and achieving with your population growth the last few years, you're one of the half a dozen communities that have things going in the right direction. And so I congratulate you on what you've accomplished and would urge you and hope that you continue to succeed in the trends that you've created for yourselves. Thank you very much.